and welcome to Book List. I'm Nancy Pearl. My guest today is author Maggie Stiefvater, whose new book, The Listeners, is her first book written for adults after a wonderful career of writing books for young adults. Fair enough, Maggie? Thank you for coming to the show.
I am hugely excited to sit down and talk with you, Nancy. Thank you for having me. Fair enough. Fair enough.
Good. All right. So, The Listeners, first I just want to say how much I loved this book and how much I felt I do love books that have what I call elastic realism. You know, when we talk about Spanish writers, you know, Gabriel Garcia Marquez et al., Isabel Allende, we talk about magical realism, but I like to think about it in different terms, like that elasticism. Like The Listeners is a realistic novel with a little bit of stretchy realism in it.
I think of it as mythic fiction, really. I was a history major, and specifically medieval history, and so many of the sources that you were required to use had deeply magical elements to them that you were asked to believe in, not the level of truly believing that there was a giant, but instead there was a metaphorical giant in the midst. And I just really fell in love with this way of telling the truth in a way that makes it truthful, even with so much of the context removed from it. So I agree. Magical realism, I love it. It feels like a very different animal than elastic. I like it. Elastic reality, where you're stretching the truth, but it's still following the rules of reality.
When you were describing this book to your agent or to your editor, or to the public, how do you describe this book?
It's interesting because I think there are two different ways to describe this book. One is the person that you're standing next to in the grocery store line who has never heard of you before, and you're just trying to convince them to pick up the book. And then you just cook with the magnificent reality of it, this very peculiar moment in American history when half a dozen or so luxury resorts in the middle of nowhere were tapped by the State Department to house Axis diplomats until they could be returned. So it's such an interesting setup to ask these fiercely patriotic communities to house the absolute enemy at the beginning of the war. And it's my corner of the world. I was born in the Shenandoah Valley. So that's one way to get into it. But it's not perhaps the most truthful way to get into it, which is it's a Maggie Stiefvater book, which means that if I'm pitching it to a Maggie Stiefvater reader, it's much easier to say, that's what the back of the book is going to say it's about, but actually it's about a woman who is trying to find her identity after coming of age. She thinks that she's done. She thinks she knows who she is. She thinks she knows what she wants. And now she's realizing at the start of the war that the whole world has changed and maybe she's changed as well. So I think there's lots of ways into it, but I don't know. I feel like those are my favorite kinds of novels to read as well.
Yeah, yes.
Different entrances.
Another thing that we share is this great interest in history, and I too have a degree in history, and medieval history was one of my favorite. In fact, I wanted to go on at one time to get a doctorate, but I couldn't decide between medieval history and Greek and Roman history. I like both of them. Yeah. So I do love what I loved about this book is one of the things I loved was that it was based on these things that really happened, as you said, that the Axis diplomats were taken to these very fancy resorts in Virginia and West Virginia, right? And so, you know, so I thought, wow, I didn't know that. That's so interesting. But then you have the main character and her growth, and then you have the elastic realism bit, and it just all worked. Yeah. What was it an easy book to write?
I feel like you asked that question knowing that the answer cannot possibly be, it just fell out of me, Nancy. It was just waiting. It was difficult in every single sense of the word. I think this is my 17th novel or something. Who knows? I've lost track at this point. And it was unlike any of my others. For starters, the research piece was, of course, enormous because not only is it historical, but it's not really distant historical. There's still plenty of people who are still alive, which made it both easier and more difficult to research in the sense that the consequences of getting it wrong felt more immediate. But also, I could pick up a telephone and I could speak to, for instance, the archivist for the Greenbrier Hotel. And that community was so wonderful. They were so keen to sit down with me and share everything they had, all of their first-hand documents. It was just stunning. But also, that made it difficult as well because as someone who's interested in history, you always have to ask yourself, is this actually interesting or is this history interesting? And you would just test it. You would sit across from your family at the dinner table or again with that beleaguered person in the grocery store line and you try out an anecdote that you just read and you wait to see if their eyes glaze over.
Right.
And if you don't, you say, so it is interesting. Okay, good. It can go into the book. So it was difficult in that sense, but it was also difficult because I wanted not just age up characters in young adult. And I love knowing that you were a young adult librarian to begin with, because having respect for that genre really means having respect for the differences in the structure of those genres, not just thinking that young adult is a simpler form of fiction that's given to teens, but instead it has all of these conventions that push it into this category. And really came of age in young adult. And young adult at the time was very low stakes. You couldn't make any money at it. You could combine every single genre into one book, and nobody was going to tell you no because we were the goth kids at the party. So it was a really magnificent place to come of age. And then I spent a decade there. Young adult really became a category. It really started to borrow a lot from the genres. It became a very immediate storytelling form. And I felt increasingly unsettled existing in that space, as if it was confining instead of letting me be playful. So looking into an adult world, I really had to take a year or two to just read dozens and dozens and dozens of adult novels across categories and genres and say, how is it different? How can I move into this world in a place I will be comfortable exploring for the next decade? So learning how to just use time on a page and tell non-linear prose, that was an entirely new learning experience that had to happen. And I'm enjoying writing my next adult novel now because of the work that past Maggie did on this one. So it was very satisfying, but yes, it was very difficult.
What sorts of books did you read in that period that influenced you or that you felt illuminated the adult world or the adult reader for you?
It was interesting because I think that there are some authors that I very easily sit next to on the shelf already. If I'm reading Piranesi, for instance, I feel like it's a very natural fit. But that's, even though I love that title, the titles that really stuck with me were the ones that seemed to have tools that I'd never used before. And so reading Barbara Kingsolver was so fascinating to watch her have a very story-based novel and yet use time and theme in a very different way. Or White Noise, which I'd never read, was amazing. Returning to Steinbeck as an adult, now thinking I'm not the goth kid at the table, but wanting to instead be a mature storyteller. These were the sorts of things that I returned back to. Even, I have to say, I reread Watership Down, and it was very interesting reading it through the lens of general adult fiction instead of genre adult fiction, and just looking at what the different cues are, and also realizing when I ran out of patience for immediate storytelling, I used to have such a capacity for it, and instead I just go, no, we need to slow down. We step out. I understand what we're looking at, but why are we looking at it? And that was a really interesting reading process.
That's gee, I want to take a course from you. I think because I think that to look at the difference between young adult fiction and adult fiction is so not subject matter or age of characters, but instead is really that sense of using the prose in a different way, I think, and I hadn't thought of it in those terms before. So the main character, the young woman, or not, she's not so young, is she? She's middle-aged. And you know, you get to a point, don't you, where you think, well, this is who I am, and it's not going to change, and this is my life. And then something much bigger than you happens, and that's real life does that, whether it's a world war that, you know, that comes in. I
I'm really
felt
fascinated with the idea of a successful life, a cumulative life, where it's very easy to have these coming of age stories where it's adult characters who are realizing they need to change. And it's always after something dreadful happens to them and they look around, and like Adam Sandler in a film, they blink about and they realize this has to change. What have I done with myself? And I thought, I don't want to tell that story. The story I want to tell is when you seem to be successful. Changing from a place of contentedness it requires so much more bravery, I think, than coming from the absolute lowest point. You know you have to change. Instead, making the choice to change is a very different thing. And it is, you talked about teaching, and I did leap into a teaching experience just after COVID, and it's impossible to not be informed. This novel was definitely informed by that process. After COVID, as soon as it opened up a little bit, I locked hundreds of writers into a Scottish castle one summer, and we just spent days and days and days. It's, of course, always sun there, so it's daytime all the time. It's perfect for a horror movie or for a novelist who is telling you, I know you really love this novel you've been working on for 10 years, but you're going to throw it away, or I'm not letting you leave this castle. And so we just really took apart all of their bad creative habits and dismantled their personalities and let them build personalities again. That sounds like a cult. I swear it wasn't a cult. But just giving them this liminal space where they were allowed to say, it's not that I'm in trouble, but I want to be something different. And I want to come to a place, choose to change, be surrounded by other people who are choosing to change. So every single year, I worked with these students until I had 200 or so of them. And then this last year, I finished it off with a boot camp where for 6 months solid, had 900 some one-on-one 30-minute Zoom calls with them. And I'm very proud of them. Many of them have book deals. All of them have reinvented themselves as humans. It was just incredible to watch, but it informed this project so much because here's June Hudson, who is managing a hotel in the middle of nowhere. And why do people come, especially in 1940, to a hotel in the middle of nowhere if they have everything at home? And it's because in the real world, they were coming to these places for that liminal space where they could be someone else. And so who is June Hudson, and what is she doing with her people there? And what can she do at scale that one woman can't do on her own? What does she need 300 staff members for? So it's absolutely impossible to not read this book myself later and look at it and think, oh, I can see you working through all of these different thoughts as well. And having seen all of these people who are middle-aged, and some of them were far beyond middle-aged, coming to a place and choosing to reinvent themselves and doing it successfully, not on a surface level. It wasn't about the book. It was about the person who could write a book. So just knowing that that was possible and what it took was, I mean, that's the heartbeat of this novel, really.
Mm-hmm. The other thing that I loved about the book was that the hotel, I kept wanting to like make a reservation and go there, you know. I just loved those descriptions of it. Well, do you think you would ever write a book, a work of fiction that didn't have that elastic realism aspect to it?
Gosh, I seriously considered it with this novel, asking myself, do I think that it needs to be heightened? Because really that's what myth does, is it takes a moment and makes it bigger. It makes it more obvious what the emotional anchor points are. And I thought, we're here looking at war and everything is changing. And then I thought, no, but the thing that we're blowing up larger by having this mystical thread of water that listens so carefully, I'm not amplifying the war, I'm amplifying June to be on the same level as the war. So I'm not sure that I will always have magic in a book, but I think I'll probably still need to play in that level of metaphor. I think that's important to me.
Do you think that writing a novel changes you as a human being? I mean, all those students that you had that were coming out of themselves to produce something, does that change you as a human being?
Teaching certainly changes you as a human being. And I would say that before this novel, I would say that writing was the thing that came after change. I'd gone through a moment, especially the novel that I think I wrote that has the most in common with this one, All the Crooked Saints. It would be informed by a process that I had lived through. In that case, it was very much, what do you do when people keep on coming to ask you for advice and then they don't take the advice? That's, it might be magic in All the Crooked Saints, but that's really the crux of it. But I already decided how I felt about that, and then I wrote about it. But when I was writing The Listeners, I did not realize that a novel could change you in the process of it. But there was something about looking straight on at the character of June Hudson and asking myself, how does she get here? How did she get this way? And why do I think she behaves this way? Because she is very similar to a character, Hannelore, the girl, the daughter of the diplomats, and quite neuroatypical. And asking myself to draw a study of that and say, how much of this is like you, and why do you think you're this way? It asked me to examine myself in a way that I don't think I had since I was a teenager. So this is not exactly a coming of age novel in that way, but it was still a moment of self-reflection, I think, that I don't think I've experienced with any of the other novels.
Yeah, yeah. It's hard not to identify with June. But one of the wonderful successes of your writing in this book is that the ending is entirely satisfactory. I wonder whether you had thought about different endings and how you, without giving anything away, I guess, so that might make it harder to answer. But I did want to talk about the ending because a lot of times in adult fiction, there isn't this satisfactory ending. I mean, there's an ending and the book ends and you turn the page, but this one, golly, it just felt so right.
That means a lot to me, Nancy, because for all that I learned and loved of my reading of adult literary fiction, you can pry four-act structure from my cold, dead claws. I do love an ending. I do love, to me, that's the point of a book, is where you arrive at. I know when you begin writing, a lot of times the point is the beginning, but as a reader, the point is the ending. How do we feel after we close that book? Right. So many novels are ruined by, you just get there and then it's over. And no, I want to feel that sense of intention, of purpose moving through. That said, there were a few other options that were, can I say this without spoiling it, that were less bittersweet, perhaps, that envisioned a different role for Hannelore. And it was really interesting because the biggest thing that changed during the course of this book for me was my impression of luxury. I was quite certain, as a extremely middle-class redneck Virginian, that I would be debunking luxury. That was my task as I was writing this novel. And it was so fascinating to sit down with the hoteliers that were so kind to give me their time. I was lucky enough to sit down with some modern-day luxury hoteliers. And one fellow in particular, I remember, he managed a property in Switzerland that went for $54,000 a night. And he was explaining to me how you pampered the rich, that you couldn't buy them anything because they could buy it for themselves. And he told me, this is what everyone wants, to be known. They truly just want to be known and wanted, but not needed. To be known on not the surface level, but so you can predict them, what they might possibly desire. That anticipation is the heart of luxury, and you can do that for free. And it was just revolutionary for me to think, of course, who wouldn't want that? And so to separate that sense of luxury from wealth was just enormous for me.
How did you find out about the diplomats being moved to the Greenbrier and whatever? I mean, what were you doing research deliberately, trying to find looking for a topic that would turn into a novel?
I would love to say that I'd found it in a very cunning way, but instead, I just ran across it because in the back of my head, I had thought for years that my next novel would be a hotel novel. I had stayed at the Gore, which is a very singular hotel in London, and every single room is different. And the time that I was staying there, that my publishers had put me there, all of the guests seemed to be extremely interesting guests who all had capital letter professions. I was the designated capital A author, but there was also a capital P physician, a capital A attorney, and to my delight, a capital E explorer, which felt like a very indulgent kind of profession to have. And I remember thinking at the time, what a nice little locked box, a little distillation of society. And so I was really just looking for hotels in history. I talked to my agent and I said, what do you think a Maggie Stiefvater novel is? And he says, I think at its heart, you go to a location in the pages that you really wish you could go to, but it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So I was looking in history for a hotel because history is a great place to find things that no longer exist. And it was a single line. And I was astonished. Like I said, I was born in the Shenandoah Valley. I could throw a rock at these mountains. And for this bit of history to have escaped me just felt like I was astonished. I was just absolutely amazed. And to imagine the kind of people that I had grown up with being the sort of people who were asked to do this, well, they are not people who suffer fools. And so it was quite a thing to imagine.
Yeah, wow. All right, Maggie, I just can't now wait for your next book, and I hope our paths will cross again. But I just want to thank you again for writing The Listeners. It meant a lot to me, and I think you're just great.
Thank you so much. This was a delight.